Spring 1940. The clouds over Britain aren't the only things hanging low. Morale in the Royal Air Force is starting to sag beneath the weight of something unseen, but deadly. It isn't German bullets doing the most damage. It isn't the firepower of the Messerschmitt Bf-109s that leaves British pilots helpless. It's a silence. A sudden, violent silence that comes mid-maneuver, mid-battle, mid-breath. A silence from an engine that was supposed to be the RAF's pride. The Spitfire, Britain's miracle of aviation, is falling short. Every time a pilot pushes the control stick forward into a dive to chase a fleeing enemy, the Merlin engine dies. Just stops. No warning. No chance of recovery before the Germans' guns fill the silence with fatal noise. By March 1940, Squadron Leader Brian Lane of 19 Squadron has had enough. Reports are stacking up. Out of 73 documented air engagements over France and the Channel, Spitfire pilots report the same deadly engine failure in 61 of them. That's 83%. An 83% failure rate on a combat maneuver. A move that could mean the difference between a kill or being killed. Lane's report lands on Air Ministry desks with the urgency of a direct hit. He spells it out. The German fighter pushes into a dive. We follow. Our engine quits. He's gone. We can't fight because our machines refuse to follow us into the fight. On March 23, 1940, at RAF Tangmere, a figure arrives who doesn't belong. Not by appearances, not by expectation. Beatrice Tilly Shilling, 29, motorcycle racer, speed record holder, and one of a tiny handful of women engineers working in British military aviation, steps onto the base tarmac. She's not supposed to be here. The Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough has sent her to see the engine failure for herself. She watches from the dispersal hut as Flight Lieutenant James Leithart demonstrates the problem. At 8,000 feet, he inverts his Spitfire Mark I and pushes the stick forward into a split S dive. The result is instant. The Merlin engine coughs, chokes, and stops. 7 long seconds later, it splutters back to life. But by then, in a real dogfight, he'd be a burning wreck. When Leithart lands, Shilling is already on the tarmac. She doesn't waste time with pleasantries. She's asking pointed technical questions that reveal she understands something even the pilots can't articulate. It's not the angle of the dive. It's not the altitude. It's the G-forces. Negative G German aircraft, the Messerschmitts, don't have this issue. Their Daimler-Benz DB601 engines use direct fuel injection. Gravity means nothing to them. They can dive, roll, flip, and twist without so much as a hiccup from their engines. Meanwhile, the British Merlin is stuck in the past, still relying on a carburetor system that uses gravity to keep fuel where it needs to be. Push into negative G, and suddenly, gravity works against you. The fuel inside the carburetor float chamber sloshes upwards, away from the jets, and the engine chokes on air instead of fuel. It's like trying to drink from a straw in a cup that's upside down. Shilling returns to Farnborough that evening, oil-stained and restless. The problem has become personal. She understands the Merlin engine better than most of the men working on it. She understands that the solution needs to be fast, cheap, and effective, because there isn't time for elegance. There's barely time for survival. On April 2nd, 1940, she begins running the numbers in her lab. The float chamber of the Merlin carburetor holds less than a liter of fuel. Under normal flight, that's more than enough. But in negative G, the system starves. The jets suck air. The engine misfires. In a dogfight, even a 3-second stall means 400 feet of lost altitude. And death. The Germans solved it with engineering sophistication. Shilling intends to solve it with mechanical intuition and a brass washer. The morning of May 4th, 1940, Shilling walks into the machine shop at Farnborough with a requisition form in her hand. On paper, she's asking for test material for fuel flow analysis. In practice, she's about to start building a workaround to a national crisis. The brass disc she requests is no larger than a shilling coin. In her garage that night, Shilling works under the yellow glow of a single bulb. Hands steady. Drills precise. She knows the risks. Too small a hole, and the Merlin will starve for fuel at full throttle. Too large, and the washer will do nothing. She drills 6 versions, 6 discs, each with a different aperture. The smallest 0.055 inches, the largest 0.068. She's not hoping for perfection. She's hunting for functional May 7th. The test begins in earnest. She reaches out to Jeffrey de Havilland Jr., a test pilot with a reputation for being willing to fly anything once. The aircraft is a Spitfire MKI, serial K9795, freshly built and not yet assigned to an operational squadron. Together with a ground crewman named Albert Foley, Shilling installs the 0.060-inch washer. No cutting, no rewiring, no alterations to the carburetor itself, just one brass disc inserted between the fuel pump and carburetor inlet. At 11:30 a.m., de Havilland takes off. Shilling watches from the field with a stopwatch in one hand and a pair of binoculars in the other. The Spitfire climbs, levels, rolls inverted, and pushes forward into a dive. Seconds tick. 1, 2, a cough. 3, 4, still running. 5, 6, 8, still holding. 11, de Havilland levels out and completes 3 more runs. The engine never quits. When he lands, the grin on his face says everything. It still hesitates, he tells her, but it doesn't quit. Held it through a full split S. The Merlin stayed alive. Shilling spends the next 3 days testing the other washer sizes. Some starve the engine at altitude. Some don't solve the G-force problem. But the 0.060-inch aperture hits the sweet spot. Restrictive enough to limit fuel slosh. Open enough to feed the engine at full power. On May 20th, she brings her results to Squadron Leader Brian Lane at RAF Duxford. Lane, skeptical but desperate, greenlights the modification on 6 of 19 Squadron's operational Spitfires. No official permission, no paperwork, just war and necessity. The first combat test comes June 3rd over Dunkirk. Flight Lieutenant James Coward chases a Messerschmitt through a roll and a dive. The German pulls away, confident the British engine will choke. It doesn't. The Merlin stutters, then holds. Coward fires, and the Messerschmitt falls. June 4th, 1940. Dunkirk burns behind the last of the British soldiers being lifted off the beaches. Europe is falling apart. France is days from collapse. Fighter Command is running on fumes and borrowed time. But something strange is happening at RAF Duxford. Pilots from 19 Squadron are coming back from sorties with wide eyes and incredulous grins. They're pulling maneuvers they were trained not to attempt. Rolls, negative G dives, split S attacks, the kind of flying that used to end with engine silence and a spiral of smoke now ends with German wreckage plunging to the channel. Word spreads like wildfire. It starts with the pilots. Fighter Command is a small world. Squadrons talk, pilots gossip, mechanics overhear, and suddenly every base in southern England is whispering about a field modification that makes a Spitfire follow through a dive like a Messerschmitt. They call it a miracle. They call it madness. They call it Miss Shilling's Orifice, not kindly. Shilling's Orifice, not kindly. Some sneer when they say it, rolling the term with a smirk, a jab at the very idea that a woman, a motorcycle racing woman with grease under her nails, might have out-engineered the establishment. The phrase is used behind closed doors in meetings full of epaulets and resentment. But the name sticks. Shilling doesn't care. She has no time to care. She's at Farnborough, elbow-deep in fuel lines, supervising production of more washers. She doesn't wait for orders. She makes calls. She writes letters. She sends blueprints to squadron mechanics with handwritten instructions in the margins. She bypasses the Air Ministry entirely, and that's when the real trouble begins. By mid-June, Spitfires in 5 squadrons are flying with the washer installed. Pilots are surviving battles they used to lose. But back in Whitehall, the engineering elite are furious. Memos fly. Meetings happen. Committees convene. One report from June 17th warns that Shilling's modification is unorthodox, unauthorized, and potentially dangerous. Another, even more scathing, accuses her of violating military engineering protocols and jeopardizing the integrity of Merlin. Engines across Fighter Command. They demand the modification be halted. They are overruled. Because the war doesn't care about engineering purity. On June 22nd, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding issues a simple order. Install the washer. Everywhere. No more debates. No more paperwork. Just results. And the results are extraordinary. By July 1st, engine cutouts during -G combat maneuvers drop by more than 60%. Pilots who once avoided forward stick pressure like death itself now embrace it. They chase, they dive, they kill, and the Germans don't understand what changed. By the end of July, Luftwaffe pilots start reporting bizarre encounters. British fighters are pursuing through dives that should leave them dead in the sky. Some German commanders think the RAF is flying a new aircraft. Others suspect sabotage. But the truth is simpler. It's a washer, a 3-pence piece of brass, drilled in a garage, tested by a woman they didn't want in the hangar. The irony is brutal. While High Command debated pressure systems and float chamber redesigns that wouldn't be ready until 1941, a mechanic in Kent is on his back under a Spitfire cowling, sliding Shilling's washer into place. He doesn't know her name. He only knows the part number and that it keeps engines running. Effectiveness trumps elegance. Function beats form. Simplicity saves lives. And Beatrice Shilling, against every expectation, is becoming one of the most important engineers in the air war over Britain. July 10th, 1940. The Battle of Britain begins. The Luftwaffe launches its first full-scale assault across the Channel. Waves of bombers, protected by tight flocks of Bf-109s, scream into British airspace. RAF squadrons scramble across southern England. The sky turns into a theater of chaos, engines roaring, tracer rounds crisscrossing like threads in a deadly loom. And in the middle of it all, Spitfires dance with Messerschmitts. But now, something's different. Flight Lieutenant Peter Gunning of 74 Squadron finds himself high above Kent, locked in a twisting fight with a veteran German ace. At 15,000 feet, the German pilot rolls inverted and drops into a -G dive. It's a familiar move, one that used to guarantee escape. Gunning doesn't even hesitate. He pushes the stick forward. The Merlin coughs once, then holds. He follows. The two fighters plunge downward. The German twists into a right bank, but Gunning's already in position. A short burst from his 8 303s, and the Messerschmitt snaps into a spin. Gunning watches it vanish into the clouds below. He doesn't know the engineer's name, but he knows something changed. Across the Channel, confusion reigns in the Luftwaffe. Pilots write in their combat diaries, "The British fighters no longer break away." A few suspect a new engine, or perhaps new training. None of them imagine the change came from a brass disc no bigger than a penny. But back at Farnborough, Shilling is under siege. By mid-July, even as combat reports praise the modification, senior engineers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment are doubling down. They issue formal objections to the widespread use of unofficial modifications. One even writes a 14-page technical brief titled, "On the Dangers of Uncalibrated Field Alterations to Carburetor Systems." Shilling isn't invited to the meeting where it's discussed. Instead, she receives word that her requisitions for more washers have been paused pending further review. Without parts, Squadrons can't install the fix. Without the fix, the hesitation returns. Without the modification, pilots die. She takes the train to London the next morning. She doesn't have an appointment. She doesn't wait for one. She walks straight into the ministry and demands an audience with Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, commander of No. 11 Group, and the man responsible for defending London and the Southeast is not an easy man to impress. He listens silently as Shilling lays out the numbers. Reduced engine failures, increased kill ratios, better morale, fewer pilot losses. When she finishes, he asks only one question. How long to equip every Spitfire in 11 Group? She answers without blinking. 3 days. If I get the washers, she gets them. The order comes down within hours. All restrictions lifted. All requisitions approved. Farnborough receives a shipment of brass stock that afternoon. Machine shops across southern England turn out washers around the clock. By July 15th, every operational Spitfire in 11 Group has the modification installed. The difference is immediate. July 20th. Over Portsmouth. Squadron leader George Barclay spots a formation of Dornier, escorted by Bf 109s. He and his wingman dive from 18,000 feet. 2 Messerschmitts swing in to intercept, rolling inverted and pushing down hard. Standard Luftwaffe doctrine. Force the British fighters into a negative G dive. Wait for the engines to quit. Then turn the tables. But the British don't break off. Barclay pushes forward. His Merlin growls but holds. He follows the lead Messerschmitt into the dive, closes to within 150 yards, and opens fire. The 109 explodes mid-air. The second German pulls into a steep climb. Barclay follows again, climbing hard. And for the first time in months, it's the German who stalls first. Later that night, Barclay writes in his logbook, "We have them now. They don't understand it yet, but we can follow them down, and we can follow them up." Meanwhile, Luftwaffe intelligence is baffled. They intercept chatter about RAF pilots pursuing through dives. They interrogate captured pilots. They recover crashed aircraft and examine the engines. But the washers are small, subtle, and easily overlooked. German engineers studying captured Spitfires from May and June find the familiar carburetors. They assume the problem still exists. They don't realize the battlefield has already changed. At RAF Duxford, Shilling visits 19 Squadron. The pilots greet her like a myth brought to life. They offer her tea. One offers her his leather flying gloves as a souvenir. Another, more blunt, says, "You saved my bloody life, miss. Don't let the brass forget it." She doesn't smile. She nods quietly and writes down a few notes about heat buildup near the new washer housing. She's already thinking about improvements. By early August, RAF kill-to-loss ratios improve sharply. In engagements where negative G maneuvers were common, the success rate jumps. What was once a suicide dive is now a hunting maneuver. The brass washer isn't elegant, but it's enough. Miss Shilling's Orifice has given the RAF something better than engineering purity. It's given them time. August 13th, 1940. Adler Tag. Eagle Day. The full weight of the Luftwaffe crashes against the southern coast of England. Göring's plan is bold. Cripple fighter command in a single blow. More than 1,400 sorties fill the skies over Kent, Sussex, and the Channel. Radar stations are hammered. Airfields bombed. But the worst of it comes from the air-to-air duels high above the countryside. The Spitfires are outnumbered, stretched thin, flying multiple sorties a day. Every pilot is exhausted. But now, thanks to a brass disc barely thicker than a coin, they are no longer outmatched. Pilot Officer Ronald Hamlin of 72 Squadron flies his second sortie of the day when he's jumped by a Messerschmitt over the Isle of Sheppey. The German rolls inverted and pushes down. It's the same trick they've used since May. The escape dive. The British are supposed to break off. Not today. Hamlin follows. Negative G. The Merlin grumbles, sputters once, and holds. The dive becomes a game of nerves. At 500 feet, the 109 pulls level, only to find Hamlin's guns blazing from 200 yards. The German aircraft shudders. Black smoke pours from its fuselage, and it plunges into the sea. The kill is confirmed by 2 other pilots. It's Hamlin's first victory, but it won't be his last. Behind the dogfights, a silent revolution is underway in hangars and dispersal huts across Britain. Brass washers, hand-machined, numbered, and inspected, are being installed by tired mechanics in rain-soaked overalls. Spitfires land, engines ticking hot, and within 20 minutes the fix is in. No redesign, no delay. Just wrench, washer, flight, even Hawker Hurricanes, long considered the workhorses of the RAF, begin receiving the modification. Though less prone to engine starvation due to different airflow characteristics, Hurricanes still benefit from the stabilized fuel flow. The washer becomes the unifying upgrade of the RAF's summer campaign. But while the squadrons embrace the solution, Whitehall remains conflicted. At the Ministry, a quiet power struggle brews. Senior engineers from the Royal Aircraft Establishment submit another report, this time 62 pages, detailing all theoretical failure points of the brass washer. They argue for halting further installations and fast-tracking their pressure carburetor solution. They include the usual concerns: thermal fatigue, flow inconsistencies, altitude-dependent fuel delivery anomalies. Shilling reads it in her office and lets it fall to the desk with a flat slap. She scribbles 3 words across the title page in pencil. It bloody works. That same evening, she attends a briefing at RAF Biggin Hill. Several squadron leaders are present, including Squadron Leader Douglas Bader of 242 Squadron, a legless ace whose flying defies every limitation ever written. Bader is blunt and battle-worn. "Whoever gave us this washer," he says, "ought to be knighted or given a motorbike and left alone to get on with it." The room laughs, but the point lands. The pilots don't care about theoretical failure modes. They care that they can finally fly their aircraft to the edge and not have the machine quit first. Meanwhile, in Germany, cracks are forming. Captured German intelligence reports show clear signs of confusion. Luftwaffe analysts debate whether British aircraft are now using fuel injection. Others believe the Spitfire has received a new engine variant. There are even suspicions of captured German technology being reverse-engineered. They are all wrong. The truth is less glamorous and far more humiliating. The Germans are losing their edge to a washer. August 24th, 1940. Flight Officer Eric Mars of 222. Squadron is flying defensive cover over Manston when 3 Messerschmitts dive out of the sun. He pulls hard into a defensive roll, then pushes the stick forward into a dive, cutting across the German lead. 2 months ago, this maneuver would have been suicide. The Merlin would have quit. He'd have dropped like a stone. But now the engine snarls but stays alive. Mars levels, pulls up into a rising turn, and reverses the fight. Seconds later, he latches onto the tail of one of the attackers and scores hits across its fuselage. One pilot, one maneuver, one tiny brass disc between life and death. By the end of August, the Air Ministry can no longer ignore the data. Failure reports plummet. Kill ratios improve. Morale lifts. Commanders quietly shift from calling the modification a bodge to referring to it as field standard issue. Nobody apologizes to Shilling. Nobody mentions her name in the official communiques, but every Spitfire flying in combat carries a piece of her workshop at Farnborough. She watches the figures on her chalkboard: sortie hours, engine cut durations, fuel pressure deltas, cold numerical confirmation of what every pilot already knows. She doesn't need a medal. She doesn't want a ceremony. She wants it to keep working, and it does. In a war fought in fractions of seconds and degrees of maneuver, Shilling's washer closes the gap. The Luftwaffe doesn't realize they've lost their edge until it's too late, because by the time the Germans understand that the RAF can dive and climb with them, British pilots are already pressing the advantage, hunting instead of surviving. And that change starts with a disc of brass. September 15th, 1940. Battle of Britain Day. The Luftwaffe sends everything it has. Bombers in tight formations stretch across the southern horizon like an iron tide. Dozens of squadrons scramble from British airfields, racing into the sky with engines screaming. Every pilot knows what this is. The big push, the last throw of the dice. And every Spitfire up that day carries Beatrice Shilling's modification. At 11:03 a.m., over the Thames estuary, Pilot Officer Nigel Hurst of 603 Squadron locks eyes on a formation of Heinkel He 1-1 escorted by Bf 109s. He rolls and dives, following one of the escorting fighters into a split S. The German reacts too late. Hurst pulls the trigger. His guns chatter. The 109 disintegrates. Minutes later, Squadron Leader Brian Lane, the same officer who first raised the alarm in March, leads an attack on a bomber formation at 15,000 feet. His Spitfire handles like a bird of prey, slicing through the escort and diving straight into the bombers. He doesn't think about the brass washer under his cowling. He just trusts it. And it works. The day ends with 56 confirmed German aircraft destroyed. The RAF loses 28. But the math tells the truth. The Luftwaffe can't sustain these losses. Fighter Command can at RAF Duxford that evening. A quiet celebration unfolds. No fireworks, just exhausted pilots sipping tea or something stronger, recounting the maneuvers they once feared to try. Lane finds Shilling by the hangars. He doesn't say much. He simply offers her a smoke and a nod. That nod is more valuable than any medal. Meanwhile, the engineering establishment continues its uncomfortable retreat. The official carburetor redesign, the pressure-balanced, spring-dampened, fully certified masterpiece, remains months from readiness. The manufacturing line isn't even tooled yet. But nobody dares propose removing the washer, because everyone now understands what the pilots always knew. The war isn't waiting for perfection. Shilling continues working in the background. She refines the washer's internal diameter, improves the manufacturing tolerances, and begins collaborating with Rolls-Royce engineers, who finally acknowledge her fix as interim critical hardware. Privately, some even call it brilliant, but the resistance hasn't vanished. One particularly senior engineer, speaking at a closed RAE forum, describes the modification as effective but embarrassing. He laments that the RAF is relying on a crude fix from a woman with a drill press. It's the last part that stings them most, because Shilling, without ever raising her voice, has done what none of them could. She solved the problem that was killing pilots. On September 28, 1940, a typed letter arrives at her office at Farnborough. It's from Squadron Leader Lane. The letter is brief. Your modification has kept pilots alive and aircraft operational. The mathematics of survival don't measure elegance, they measure effectiveness. Thank you for understanding the difference. She tucks the letter into the drawer beside her notes. She doesn't frame it. She doesn't show anyone. Because the battle isn't over yet. October brings colder skies and increasingly desperate attacks by the Luftwaffe. But something fundamental has shifted. RAF pilots fight with confidence they didn't have in the spring. They follow instinct, not fear. They don't hesitate to roll, dive, or push. And the German aces? They start dying. On October 10th, Oberleutnant Dieter Graub, a veteran with 14 kills, is shot down by a Spitfire over the Solent. His last maneuver? An inverted dive meant to force an engine stall. The RAF pilot followed him down, engine intact. On October 18th, a captured German pilot is interrogated. He says simply, "The Spitfires do not stop anymore." Exactly, by the end of October, the Luftwaffe shifts its strategy from daylight raids to night bombings. It's an admission of defeat in the skies. Fighter Command holds. Britain holds. And history will one day remember the Spitfire as the symbol of that resistance, the engine roar that turned the tide. What history may forget is that for every roar, there was once a cough, a sputter, a silence, and a woman who refused to let it stay that way. November 1940. The Blitz is in full fury. London burns most nights. Coventry is flattened. British cities shudder beneath German bombs. But in the skies above, something crucial has changed. The RAF is still standing. The Luftwaffe, once convinced that it could grind Fighter Command into ash, has been beaten back. Not decisively, not permanently, but enough to prove that Britain won't fall from the air. And in the quiet corners of that survival, Beatrice Shilling continues working. She doesn't celebrate. She doesn't stop. Doesn't celebrate. She doesn't stop. In her lab at Farnborough, a disassembled Merlin engine sits in the corner. On her desk, carburetor diagrams, pressure charts, new brass washer schematics. The Battle of Britain may be over, but the war has only just begun. Shilling understands that the Germans will adapt. Their aircraft will evolve. So must the RAF. She proposes a new washer model, a dual-stage restrictor that can maintain pressure during both negative and sudden positive G transitions. Rolls-Royce engineers listen more closely now. They still frown at the simplicity, but no one dares ignore her. By December, she's helping test components for the Merlin XX engine, which will power the Hurricane Mach-2 and the twin-engine Beaufighter. Her knowledge of pressure-fed systems becomes critical in early jet propulsion studies. Quietly, and without fanfare, she begins laying the groundwork for Britain's entry into the jet age. But while Shilling moves forward, her legacy is already sinking into obscurity. Young pilots in training squadrons are taught about the Spitfire's capabilities. They learn the Merlin's quirks. They're told to trust the fuel feed during dives. But no one tells them why it works now when it didn't before. No one tells them about the brass washer. No one mentions her name. At RAF Coltishall, a new pilot named Raymond Fletcher asks his mechanic about the part. He found it in the engine schematic, a small brass insert in the fuel line. The mechanic shrugs. Regulation mod. Standard fitting now. Don't touch it. That's all. 3 pence worth of brass has become invisible. Essential, but anonymous. Like most infrastructure, its value is only understood when it fails. And this washer hasn't failed once since it went operational. Meanwhile, the Royal Aircraft Establishment finally completes their pressure carburetor system. It's elegant, complex, beautiful. It goes into testing in early 1941. Certified by spring. Installed in limited aircraft by summer. But by then, Fighter Command is flying a new kind of war. In April 1941, RAF bombers begin hitting targets deep in Germany. The Luftwaffe is now on the defensive. Fighters escorting bombers to Bremen and Kiel aren't diving away to escape anymore. They're staying in formation, pressing in. Spitfires engage German fighters in the skies over Europe. The engine failure during a negative G dive, once a death sentence, is now a historical footnote. The brass washer is still in the line, still doing its job, and Beatrice Shilling, she's now working with Frank Whittle's early jet turbine teams, contributing her knowledge of fuel control systems to the world's first operational jet engine. She still rides motorcycles on weekends, one RAF test pilot, after seeing her roar through the countryside on a stripped-down Norton with her long coat flapping, says, "It's like seeing Newton on a Harley." the war continues, and though her name remains buried beneath the louder voices of officers and designers, her work endures. One day in the summer of 1942, a young American officer touring RAF facilities is shown the brass washer. The technician tells him it was invented by a woman engineer, name escapes me. Solved our dive problem in 1940. The American nods. He takes the idea back to the U.S. Months later, P-51 Mustangs receive a modified fuel restrictor based on Shilling's design. Her work crosses oceans, quietly, effectively, and always without. Credit. November 18, 1990. Beatrice Shilling dies at the age of 79. The obituary in the Times is short. 4 paragraphs. It mentions her service during the war, her work on aircraft engines, and her later research in jet propulsion. There is no mention of the washer, no mention of Spitfires, no mention of the summer of 1940. The obituary in the Daily Telegraph includes a grainy photograph of her beside a Spitfire, mislabeling it as a Hurricane. It describes her as a notable figure in aviation engineering. That's all, but quietly. In homes and museums and old airfields, the people who remember her are not so quick to forget. At the Imperial War Museum, a small display case holds a Merlin engine cross-section. Inside, tucked almost invisibly within the maze of metal, is a brass disc. Polished. Ordinary. Beneath it, a plaque reads, Standard RAF Fuel Flow Restrictor, 1940, designed by Beatrice Shilling, Royal Aircraft Establishment, unofficially credited with saving hundreds of lives during the Battle of Britain. It takes decades for her story to find proper footing in the world of history. In 2003, her personnel file is declassified. Engineers and historians studying wartime innovations rediscover the field notes, the requisition forms, the test data. The field reports that repeatedly attribute successful pursuit kills to the new fuel restrictor. They begin piecing it all together. A woman engineer, a simple solution, a life-saving difference. In 2013, the Royal Academy of Engineering adds her to their Engineering Heritage Series. A blue plaque is mounted outside the old Farnborough building where she spent most of her wartime years. In 2017, the Brooklands Museum features her in a major exhibition on women in motorsport and engineering. A replica of her 1940 workshop is displayed with tools, notes, and, at the center, a brass washer mounted under glass like a holy relic. In engineering schools, her work is now cited in case studies about rapid prototyping and minimum viable solutions. Professors speak of her approach not just with respect, but with urgency. Because the lesson Shilling left behind is not only technical, it's philosophical. Adequate now is sometimes better than perfect too late. In a world that glorifies complex solutions and long-term planning, she proved that sometimes the fastest, simplest, cheapest path is the one that wins the battle. Not by theory, by survival. In a dusty Birmingham metalworks that once made plumbing fittings, a machinist keeps a copy of the original tool stamp they used to make the washers. It's framed above his bench, a reminder of the time a piece of plumbing hardware saved the skies of Britain. And in the office of a senior engineer at Rolls-Royce, there's a paperweight on the desk. It's a replica washer, polished and heavy, a gift from a colleague. The inscription reads, Miss Shilling's Orifice, because good enough was just enough. Beatrice never married. She had no children. She never once gave a public lecture about her role in the war. She didn't write a memoir. She didn't sit for interviews, because she believed her work spoke loud enough, and it did. 3 pence of brass, 15 minutes to install. One war-changing result. While others drafted blueprints for the future, she reached into the toolbox and changed the present. Not with funding, not with fanfare, but with conviction. She knew the risk of doing nothing, of waiting of trusting process over outcome. She knew that the real enemy was time, and she beat it. When people ask what turned the tide over Britain in 1940, they expect answers like radar, hurricanes, Churchill's speeches, or the courage of the few. And they're not wrong. But in the silence between two bursts of gunfire, in the seconds between pursuit and escape, in the breathless moments when a Spitfire dove and didn't die, there was also something else. A small, stubborn, brilliant act of engineering. Beatrice Shilling didn't win the war, but she made sure Britain could keep fighting it.